Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu filling in for Riz Khan. Our guest today is an industrial designer who's achieved rock star status. Born in Cairo, raised in Canada and currently based in New York, Karim Rashid brings a unique perspective to industrial design. Whether it's a contemporary dresser inspired by Egypt's Great Pyramids or a beautiful dirt devil cone hand vac, Karim believes that design should not be exclusive, produced only for the elite, but should be accessible to everyone. On today's program, we talk to designer extraordinaire Karim Rashid about the universal language of design and its future. Karim, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
You're welcome. I want to ask you about design and the world of design. And while I was researching this, I came across a number of times people who have very misconceptions about what designers do, what the world of design is about. Most often they think that design is involved with fashion design, but they of course are all different kinds of design and designers. Now you are an industrial designer, that's your specialty. What exactly does an industrial designer do?
Well, an industrial designer is really designing for industry. So in turn, we develop and shape products and commodity for everyday life and that industry produces. So, you know, really, you could say that industrial design started with the Industrial Revolution 160 years ago. But, you know, as the field is so broad because when you think about it, the entire built environment is all created by industry. So it's a massive field. So within that field, obviously, there's kind of specialization. Some people become furniture designers, some people are tabletop designers, some people are high-tech designers. So it's basically every physical man-made object in the world that's industrial design.
And someone has to design that. Now, do you have a particularly individual style that you bring to the world of design?
Well, you know, I have to say that, you know, when I was a child, you know, my father was a painter and a set designer for film and television in Cairo in Egyptian television. Also, he worked with BBC and Cinecittà and CBC in Canada. And being brought up in an environment, a kind of creative environment, my father had that sense of a bit of a Renaissance man. You know, one minute he would be designing the furniture in our house. Next minute he's painting, and maybe on a Sunday he used to do fantastic things that were so inspiring to me as a child. Like he would actually start sketching some dresses, pull out some fabric, cut it, the dress, sew it, and for my mother, and then that night they'd go out to a party wearing the dress. So when I saw that, I thought, wow, you know, as a kind of creator, and there's been this kind of history of Renaissance people of that nature, whether it's been, you know, Leonardo da Vinci all the way up to people even like Picasso or to, you know, Tatlin or Rodchenko or Le Corbusier, who are people who, on one hand, they may be artists and they're painting, on the other hand, they're kind of building the industrial world. And so that was part of my upbringing, and I always felt that that's my kind of role and participation in the world will be to kind of touch every part of our physical environment. So I don't really see any boundaries between, you know, designing a shoe or designing a building or an interior. And it's a fascinating world in that way because what we really do as designers is, I think, is that we have to kind of shape a contemporary world, shape a kind of contemporary existence that as human beings we kind of interface with, you know, 500, 600, 700 objects a day, and these are the things that we have to make more interesting, more inspiring, more experiential, more beautiful, more sustainable, all these kind of levels and so many issues.
We hear these catchwords like form and function. I mean, you described all those other attributes of good design, you know, things like beauty, but, you know, does a well-designed object have to be practical?
You know, not necessarily. It doesn't have to be. I personally believe everything I do has to be very, very practical because that's my, you know, I've got like a kind of good left-right balance. On one hand, I want to do things that are very original and very creative, but on the other hand, I know that if they're very practical, then I'll reach a broader audience, that people will actually enjoy and use these things. But there's been a plethora of objects that have been known as, let's say, design icons that have been very impractical objects. In fact, most of them that we know as design icons sometimes don't even really work very well. So, you know, there's one thing is kind of the high art, the intellectual kind of take on all this, and then the other is the, you know, more democratic art, which I believe that's what design is, where it's just these things that we have in everyday life that can be really amazingly, exceptionally inspiring and beautiful, but they gotta work. For me, they have to work. And if they work, they kind of live with you longer. They can become part of your life for more longevity. And they actually kind of grow with you. You know, we have a lot of objects in our world, I think, that we start to really enjoy or are a big part of our lives because they're working well for us individually.
You know, there is a perception that good design is only for the wealthy. Is that a fair comment?
It is a fair comment, and that's what I've been fighting against for 15 years, since I opened my practice in New York. I'm trying to make design part of mass culture, part of everyday life. I really dislike the idea, actually, that design is relegated to the elite. And you know, how all this came about, I've been kind of trying to understand, why do these really large corporations and large companies not really embrace design? And now times are changing, obviously. But 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I mean, most large companies, you know, design was like at the, let's say, bottom of their tier, or in the sense of importance, let's say, in what they produce. And I never understood it until you know, probably in the last 10, 15 years, when I realized that it's all the little companies, the very small entrepreneurs, and especially the more kind of quality-driven companies and small companies that are interested in innovation. So in turn, it's a small company. If a small company decides to make a new sofa, for example, and they're trying to do something new using a new material, new technology, new form, new production method, et cetera, of course, inevitably, because they're small, their distribution is going to be small. They're probably going to make things more on a slower production cycle. So in turn, the goods are more expensive. So inevitable, the catch here is that we end up, every time we try to innovate, the innovation is with the smaller people, and in turn, those smaller people, then in turn, the goods become much more expensive. So I'm always a bit frustrated like that. I know that a lot of times let's say with an Italian manufacturer, and we're working on a chair, a stacking chair, and I know very well that stacking chair, if the volume was higher and I was actually producing the tooling in China, for example, and had a better distribution, and et cetera, that chair could be quarter the price. I'm so aware of these things now, that for me, that the only reason that actually products should be in the luxury market or in the luxury sector is if they're bringing something substantially more than, let's say, a middle-priced or lower-priced commodity is, if that makes sense. In other words, something in the high-end luxury market shouldn't necessarily be so expensive just because it's branded. It should be more expensive because it is really luxurious, you know, whatever that means. I mean, the definition of luxurious is changing, obviously, too. But, yeah.
I think that's, yeah, it's obviously a relative term. You know, looking at, you know, the kind of design that could be accessible to, say, low-income people, especially in developing countries and things like this, we find some of the designing that is so uninspiring. Take low-cost housing, for instance, which, you know, you find a lot of in developing countries. Why does it have to be so drab, boxy? You know, we never see innovative designing there.
Yeah, exactly. Sure. I don't know if we had this discussion when we met in Cape Town. But I was quite fascinated when I arrived in Cape Town at the shanty towns, obviously, and you know, I took a tour of them and I saw them coming in off the plane. And there was an article in the paper when I was there that there was some architecture firm actually that was hired to design housing for them, and it was basically concrete cubes with a tiny little square window in it and a door. It was incredibly depressing, and I even remember mentioning at my lecture how I could probably design those houses for, and they were going to cost $3,000 each. I could probably mass produce and design a house for roughly $3,000 or less that could be reconfigurable, colorful, beautiful, probably work more efficiently, more lightweight, easier to put up. You know, the world of the industry, with using industry and really embracing and celebrating and engaging industry, it's amazing what we can do in the world. You know, and I think that a lot of times when you use the word drab, I think a lot of it, we kind of have created a very, very drab world in a way. You know, and most of our cityscapes and our urban fabric is generally grays and kind of dark and lack of color, lack of innovation, lack of technology, lack of new materials, you know, lack of a kind of embracement of a kind of more beautiful, more poetic world. And I'm a big believer in trying to shape this new world, this world that I would consider not only more poetic, but kind of more softer and more casual and more lightweight and more immaterial. I mean, and now we're kind of at that moment, I think. We're at a bit of a pinnacle where we're shifting from this kind of drab world, and design is becoming such a public subject now that companies are starting to realize that design is going to give them an edge, or design is going to differentiate them from one brand to another, or design can actually make more humanitarian consideration, more deal and make human life better. And the agenda, going back to design, again, going back to Industrial Revolution, was this kind of betterment for society. It was a very kind of social agenda originally. And I think design is once becoming, again, a social agenda, but a social agenda with something about a real kind of beautification of our world.
I've got a question here from one of our viewers in Pennsylvania here in the United States. It's Richard writing to us, and he asks, out of the more than 2,500 objects you have introduced to the world, which would you say is the most eco-friendly, and which one is your personal favorite?
Okay, well, the eco-friendly. First, I think I've designed many objects that are very eco-friendly, and this question's come up. I mean, it's funny. Here we are in 2008, and all of a sudden everybody's talking about the ecology and sustainability. Well, I was brought up talking about the ecology and sustainability in the 70s, and in fact, there was a book written in 1971 called "Design for the Real World" by somebody named Victor Papanak, which is probably the largest selling design book ever in history, something like 20 million copies. And he was one of my teachers, one of my professors. So this idea of designing to be eco-conscious has always been a given for me. And so if I take something like that's well known, let's say the Garbo wastebasket I designed for Umbra, they've sold now 10 million or 15 million or something kind of crazy like that. That is a 100% polypropylene, recycled polypropylene can. So first of all, it's made from recycled plastic. Second of all, polypropylene you can recycle almost forever. Thirdly, if you burn polypropylene, you basically get vapor, which is water. So it's a very eco-conscious polymer. So if you know your plastics, I think what I do with companies is I kind of work with them to understand that we should be using the right plastics. There are bad plastics out there and there are good plastics out there. So the Garbo could be one. I designed a line of cosmetics, which is now already 6-7 years ago, skincare, and they're not on the market anymore. But the idea was that when you use them, skincare, when you break the valves open, the little containers, and you use, let's say, a facial moisturizer, because you're breaking a valve, that moisturizer, of a very high-end moisturizer, is never touching the air prior. So there's no bacteria, it can't, it's at the highest quality possible. When you snap the little thing afterwards, the package itself would dissolve into water because it was made of a bioplastic. So, basically you wouldn't have any packaging. And I tried to introduce many years now in the high-end cosmetic business with Rizz Miyake, Kenzo, many companies I work for, to make secondary packaging. So rather than have this idea of, that you're buying a secondary packaging the minute you get home, and usually secondary packaging is very luxurious and very expensive and really a waste, is you're throwing it out. Instead, the secondary packaging was a useful object. So for example, in cosmetics, I was making a cologne and a deodorant. It would come into a secondary package. When you buy and you bring it home, that secondary package was actually a toiletry bag that you could use for the next 20 years. So it's kind of the way I think about products, is that I think about how can I use kind of innovation, new materials, new technologies and stuff to actually make this kind of more eco-friendly world, make it make sense in a way. Because the reality is, the commodities happening, the plastics are happening, the products are happening around us. If the designer wasn't involved in the process, manufacturers are not going to stop manufacturing. The mechanizations of the 20th century are in place, and they're moving faster and faster and faster. So I am here, and we are here, just to kind of make all that commodity they produce more human. What's my favorite product? My favorite product is always probably what I'm working on at this moment, because that's the way I think. I'm kind of moving very fast. And I'm very concerned. I have about 80 projects right now in the office, and so my mind is solely focused on that. So,
well, I want to talk about you a bit. You recently shifted your focus
sure.
to Eastern Europe. I was reading while I was doing the research that you've grown tired of Western cities like New York, London, Paris, and Milan, and you're now focusing on Eastern Europe. Why Eastern Europe?
Well, that happened to be an article of why I've done a lot of projects in Eastern Europe. So I said that I'm tired of those kind of big urban places because I don't find them very inspiring anymore. In fact, nobody ever wants to admit this, but I'll admit it, is that New York is a dull, banal place now. It's kind of lost its edge. It sounds harsh what I'm saying, but it's a reality. New York has become very, very, very American. And that's not bad. America is not a bad thing. It's just that real kind of, how can I say, that really tumultuous, kind of rigorous complexity of diversity of stratas, of race, of culture, of creed in New York, and the artist culture and the kind of creative culture is all kind of disappearing in a way. You know, New York's becoming a real playground for the rich in a way, and it's, you know, being condoized, and it's become like a shopping mall. Well, you know, I thought New York was the only city going through that, but now I'm seeing that London is going through that in a major way. Paris is now going through that, and the so-called charm that we see in those cities, like Paris and Venice and cities that we've known, for me personally, they kind of, in a way, I don't find it charming anymore. I find it just kind of boring in a way. You know, I have to say I've seen the city, maybe because I'm spoiled, I've seen the city too many times. I've worked in all these cities so much. But I also just kind of find old cities and the idea of a kind of old urban context, kind of for me personally, just dirty and uninspiring. So I'm very interested in where this opportunity to build and to do things that are very new. And for me, it's twofold right now. I think it's Eastern Europe. There's so much to do, and there's such talent and intellect and people that are very ready to do great things. I also find that with the Middle East, too. And I'm doing a lot of projects in the Middle East, and I find the same thing happening. And that's a kind of inevitable cycle, I think, for the urban, for metropolises in this world. We always believe that when a city becomes important or famous, now I'm starting to look at cities and countries almost as brands, where we believe that they're so powerful that they're never going to really lose their their audience, let's say. But inevitably they do lose their audience, and they do lose their reputation. But it just takes so much longer. And I always had a theory in a way, overnight you can gain a reputation, but it takes forever to lose it. Well, I think that we just kind of hang on to the nostalgia and the idea of places rather than the reality of what's really going on. And I want to be in places that, to me, are inspiring and people are ready to do new things.
Okay, Karim, I just want to get in a quick email. We don't have too much time. We have about a minute. And this is from Kenneth Miles from Washington in the United States. And Kenneth writes, what advice do you have for an aspiring design student?
Work really, really hard. You know, I think now I've been designing 25 years, and I probably worked with 500 companies or something, and I don't stop working. I actually work 7 days a week, and I love every moment of what I do. Number one. Number two is you learn everything you can about the subject you're working in, so that if you got 3 weeks to work on a bent plywood chair, you better know everything about bending plywood and or the culture of the company you work with. In other words, you try to absorb yourself in each project for that moment. Like, you know, my expression is dive in the deep end. And the third part of it is that don't chase fame and editorials and everything. You know, you mentioned I was a kind of rock star and all this, is that we become, you know, all of a sudden we've created rock stars in every profession now. It's like, that's not something to inspire to. What's inspired to is to do great work, and inevitably that will come and follow.
Thank you very much, Karim Rashid. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
You're
Best
welcome.
to everybody. Let's shape a beautiful world. Let's shape a beautiful world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us. Riz is back on Monday with cellist Yo-Yo Ma. Don't forget, if you have any thoughts about pressing issues around the world, send your emails to riz@aljazeera.net. See you next time. Street Talk is next.